At first glance, this 1879 photograph seems like a simple moment of innocence, but what lies hidden within it can be seen not with the eyes, but with courage. The photograph had survived by being overlooked. Tucked between brittle ledgers and land deeds, it showed a young enslaved child seated on a wooden step, hands folded, eyes calm, almost gentle. The image carried the quiet tenderness of something meant to reassure. Proof, perhaps, that cruelty could coexist with care, that the past was softer than it truly was. The paper had yellowed, the edges curled inward like tired fingers, but the child's face remained startlingly clear, as if time had decided to spare that expression alone. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The light fell naturally across the child's cheek. The background washed boards, a suggestion of open air. Felt ordinary, even peaceful. It was the kind of photograph historians labeled and moved past, comforted by its simplicity. Yet the longer it was studied, the more that simplicity began to feel rehearsed. The eyes did not reflect the light as they should have. They appeared to absorb it, holding it in a way that made the gaze feel heavier with every passing second. When the image was scanned and enlarged, silence settled over the lab. The child's shadow did not agree with the body that cast it. It leaned in a direction the sun could not have occupied, stretching into a shape that seemed almost intentional. Fine scratches, once dismissed as age, traced patterns too precise to be accidental. Someone had returned to this photograph again and again, altering it with care, as if correcting a truth that threatened to surface. What unsettled the experts most was not what they could prove, but what they felt compelled to stop doing. No one wanted to be alone with the image. The longer it remained on the screen, the more it seemed to resist being understood as a relic. It did not behave like the past. It watched like something waiting, patient, certain that eventually someone would look long enough to see what had been done, and what had been taken. The photograph's return to attention did not begin with discovery so much as with chance. It had been sitting for decades inside a narrow archival box, misfiled among tax records and correspondence that few researchers ever requested. The image itself was small, its surface dulled by age, its corners softened from repeated handling long before it was forgotten. Archivists had catalogued it with a brief, almost careless description: unnamed enslaved child, rural plantation, late 19th century. There was nothing about it that suggested importance, and for years it existed only as background noise within the vast, uncomfortable history of bondage. One image among thousands that documented a system rather than an individual life. Its reappearance was triggered by a private estate donation in which several family collections were merged and digitized for preservation. During this process, archivists noticed that the photograph had been referenced in multiple ledgers under slightly different dates, a quiet inconsistency that suggested it had once held more significance than its label implied. The same image had been described as a keepsake, a study, and in one instance, a proof, though proof of what was never explained. This inconsistency alone was not unusual, but it was enough to prompt a closer look, especially as institutions became more aware of how often enslaved people's identities were deliberately obscured or erased. When the photograph was scanned at high resolution for the first time, scholars were struck by its composition. Unlike many images of enslaved individuals from that period, which were overtly staged to emphasize labor or submission, this one appeared deliberately gentle. The child was seated, not working, not restrained, dressed in clean clothing that suggested care or at least the performance of it. The pose felt intimate, almost familial, as though the photographer wanted to present the scene as benign. This immediately raised questions about intent, because photography in 1879 was rarely casual, especially when the subject was an enslaved child. Every photograph required time, money, and purpose, and scholars began to ask why this particular image had been created at all. As word spread among historians and visual culture experts, the photograph began to circulate quietly through academic circles. It was discussed in emails, mentioned in conference-side conversations, and shared in limited-access digital folders. What unsettled many was how easily the image invited misinterpretation. At first glance, it could be used to support a false narrative of kindness within an inherently brutal system. Some worried that, without deeper scrutiny, it could be weaponized to soften the historical reality of enslavement. That concern alone made the photograph worthy of attention, as it represented not just a child frozen in time, but a visual argument shaped by those in power. Further examination of plantation records connected to the estate from which the photograph originated revealed another troubling detail. There were references to a child of similar age listed in inventory documents but never named, marked only by age and physical description. Shortly after the approximate date the photograph was taken, those references stopped entirely, replaced by vague notations that suggested transfer or loss without explanation. This disappearance aligned too closely with the photograph's existence to be ignored, hinting that the image might be tied to an event rather than a memory. The emotional impact of the photograph also played a role in its resurfacing. Researchers reported an unusual hesitation when working with it, a sense of discomfort that went beyond the expected weight of its subject matter. This was not simply the sorrow of seeing an enslaved child. It was a feeling that the image itself was withholding something. The child's expression was calm, but not vacant, attentive but not engaged, as though listening to something outside the frame. That ambiguity made the photograph difficult to categorize and impossible to dismiss. As institutions debated whether and how to publicly display the image, ethical questions emerged. Who had taken this photograph, and for whom was it intended? Was it documentation, possession, or something closer to confession? The absence of any accompanying explanation made it feel unfinished, like a sentence cut off before revealing its meaning. In an era when photography was often used to assert control, the tenderness of the image felt suspicious, prompting experts to consider whether it was designed to conceal harm rather than record humanity. The photograph's survival itself became part of the mystery. Many similar images had been lost, destroyed, or deliberately discarded, yet this one had been preserved with care, passed down through generations, protected from damage even as its context faded. That kind of preservation suggested intention, as though someone believed the image needed to endure, even if no one was meant to talk about it openly. The idea that an object could be saved not for remembrance, but for silence unsettled those who studied it. By the time the photograph was formally reintroduced into scholarly review, it was no longer seen as a simple historical artifact. It had become a focal point for broader questions about how images are used to shape memory and how the lives of enslaved children were recorded, distorted, or deliberately misrepresented. What began as a quiet rediscovery evolved into an uneasy recognition that this photograph was not merely depicting a moment, but participating in something ongoing, something that extended beyond the frame and into the present, where its meaning continued to shift the longer it was examined. The second turning point emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through meticulous observation, kind that comes only after an image has been studied long enough for its surface assurances to wear thin. Once the photograph was digitized at a resolution far beyond what the human eye could comfortably process, experts began to notice details that felt subtly, persistently wrong. At first, these inconsistencies were dismissed as the natural artifacts of age. Warping paper, chemical fading, the uneven hand of early photographic processes. But the more closely the image was examined, the less those explanations held. The child's posture became the first point of concern. In most 19th century photographs, especially those involving children, stiffness was expected. Long exposure times required subjects to remain unnaturally still, often aided by hidden braces or supports. Yet in this image, the child appeared both rigid and relaxed at the same time, the spine too straight, the shoulders too settled, as though the body had been arranged rather than simply posed. The hands were folded in a manner that suggested instruction, but the tension in the fingers did not match the calm of the rest of the figure. It was a small contradiction, but one that resisted easy interpretation. The gaze proved even more troubling. The child was not looking directly at the camera, which would have been common, nor was the gaze fully averted. Instead, it rested slightly to the side, focused on a point just outside the frame. This alone was not unusual, but the intensity of the focus was. Early lenses often softened eyes, blurring detail, yet here the eyes remained unnervingly precise. Light did not reflect in them as expected. There was no clear catchlight, no familiar glint that suggested a shared space between subject and viewer. Instead, the eyes appeared darker the more they were enlarged, as though depth had been added where none should exist. Lighting inconsistencies began to surface next. Experts mapped the direction of light across the child's face, clothing, and the wooden steps behind them. According to the shadows, the light source should have been positioned high and to the left. Likely the sun filtered through an open doorway or window. Yet the shadow beneath the child's chin fell too sharply, and the shadow cast by the folded hands contradicted the angle suggested by the background. These were not the random errors of an inexperienced photographer. They were precise enough to suggest either deliberate manipulation or the presence of an element no longer visible in the frame. The background itself refused to remain passive under scrutiny. What initially appeared to be simple wooden boards began to show subtle variations in tone that did not align with natural grain or wear. Under spectral analysis, certain areas responded differently to light, indicating that parts of the background may have been altered or reinforced after the photograph was taken. This was deeply unusual for a period when photographs were expensive and typically left untouched once developed. Alteration required the photograph to matter enough to revisit, to invest time and effort into reshaping its final appearance. As these observations accumulated, the photograph began to feel less like a single moment captured in time and more like a constructed object, revised and controlled. Experts compared it to other images from the same region and era, noting how rarely such care was taken with photographs of enslaved individuals. Most were utilitarian, designed to document ownership, labor, or physical condition. This image, by contrast, seemed curated, its imperfections carefully balanced to maintain an illusion of simplicity. Perhaps the most disturbing inconsistency lay in the child's relationship to the space around them. Measurements suggested that the proportions of the body did not align perfectly with the scale of the steps and boards. The child appeared fractionally too close to the foreground, as if layered onto the scene rather than seated within it. This was not evidence of modern digital manipulation, but it did suggest composite techniques or retouching methods that were rare and difficult in 1879, yet not impossible for someone with access and intent. The longer analysts worked, the more they reported a creeping sense of unease that went beyond academic curiosity. There was a growing awareness that the photograph was resisting being read as a straightforward document. Every time one inconsistency was explained away, another emerged, quieter but more insistent. It was as though the image had been designed to withstand casual viewing while punishing prolonged attention with doubt. Discussions shifted from whether the photograph was authentic to what kind of authenticity it represented. Was it a truthful record of a moment, or a carefully engineered representation meant to convey a specific narrative? And if so, what had been excluded from the frame to make that narrative work? The idea that absence could be as deliberate as presence began to take hold, especially given the historical context in which enslaved children's suffering was routinely minimized or erased. By the end of this phase of analysis, experts were no longer asking whether something was wrong with the photograph. They were asking what had been done to make it appear right. The image's sweetness now felt calculated, its calm surface masking a series of quiet interventions that suggested control, concealment, and intention, leaving behind the unsettling possibility that what disturbed them most was not a flaw, but a design that had succeeded for more than a century. The third turning point arrived with technology rather than intuition. though intuition had prepared the ground for it. Once doubts about posture, gaze, and lighting had accumulated beyond coincidence, conservators decided to examine the photograph using non-invasive imaging techniques designed to reveal what the naked eye could not. Infrared, ultraviolet, and multispectral scans were standard tools for identifying pigments, repairs, and aging patterns, and no one expected anything more than confirmation of minor retouching common to the era. What emerged instead was a mark so subtle that it had survived more than a century of handling, cataloging, and casual study without being noticed. Under ultraviolet light, a faint irregularity appeared near the child's upper torso, just where the folds of clothing deepened into shadow. At first it looked like a stain, the kind left by moisture or improper storage, but its edges were too clean, too deliberate. When the image was isolated and enhanced, the shape resolved into something more intentional. A symbol etched lightly into the photographic surface, not scratched in haste, but inscribed with control. It was not large enough to be seen at normal viewing distance, nor bold enough to disrupt the composition, yet it was undeniably present. Further analysis revealed that the mark was not the result of damage or later vandalism. The chemicals used to create it matched the photographic materials of the period, meaning it had been added either during development or shortly thereafter. This discovery shifted the tone of the investigation immediately. Damage is accidental, but alteration implies purpose, and purpose demands explanation. Someone had taken the time to return to this photograph and leave a sign that was never meant to be obvious. A message hidden in plain sight. As imaging specialists adjusted wavelengths and contrast, more details emerged. The mark was not random in shape. Its lines followed a consistent pattern, repeating curves and angles that suggested symbolism rather than decoration. Some researchers compared it to shorthand marks used in plantation ledgers, while others noted similarities to symbols employed in inventory systems, where human lives were reduced to coded entries. The possibility that the mark functioned as an identifier rather than an embellishment introduced a chilling implication. The child in the photograph may have been catalogued not just on paper, but visually marked as well. What made the discovery especially disturbing was the care taken to conceal it. The mark had been placed where natural shadows would disguise it, integrated into the existing tones of the image so seamlessly that it appeared organic. This was not a warning meant to be read, nor a signature meant to be claimed. It was something meant to exist quietly, recognized only by those who knew to look for it. The photograph, once thought to be sentimental, now resembled an object designed for a private understanding. As news of the mark spread among experts, debates intensified. Some argued that the symbol might have been added later, perhaps as part of an archival system now lost to time. Others pointed out that its placement and chemical composition aligned too closely with the original development process to support that theory. The more conservative voices urged caution, but even they could not deny that the mark's presence transformed the image's meaning. It was no longer possible to view the photograph as a passive record. It had been interacted with, modified, and, in a sense, activated. The emotional reaction among those studying the photograph grew heavier. The idea that an enslaved child's image had been altered after the moment of capture suggested an extension of control beyond life itself. Photography had frozen the child in time, but the mark implied ownership that persisted even in representation. This realization reframed earlier observations. The odd posture, the careful lighting, the misleading calm all seemed to align with the same impulse, to manage how the child was seen, remembered, and understood. Attempts to trace the symbol through historical records yielded little clarity. No exact match was found in known archives, though fragments of similar markings appeared sporadically in estate inventories and private correspondence. In some cases, symbols replaced names entirely, as though abstraction made the act of record keeping easier. The lack of definitive answers only deepened the unease. If the symbol's meaning had been common knowledge at the time, its absence from modern understanding suggested a deliberate forgetting, a knowledge passed down selectively or allowed to vanish once it no longer served its function. Perhaps most unsettling was the realization that the mark altered the photograph's relationship with the viewer. Knowing it was there changed how the image was experienced, even when the mark itself was invisible. The photograph now carried a dual existence, what it appeared to show and what it secretly contained. This duality mirrored the broader history of enslavement, in which surface narratives often concealed far harsher realities beneath. The photograph, in this sense, was not an exception, but a concentrated expression of that pattern. As experts sat with the implications, the image silence began to feel oppressive rather than neutral. The child's calm expression no longer read as peaceful but as constrained, shaped by forces outside the frame and beyond the moment. The hidden mark did not explain everything, but it confirmed something essential. This photograph had been intentionally altered to carry a meaning that was never meant to be shared openly, a quiet inscription of power embedded so deeply into its surface that it had waited patiently for technology and time to finally bring it back into the light. The fourth turning point shifted investigation away from the photograph itself and into the paper trail that surrounded it, a move that at first seemed unlikely to yield anything concrete. Plantation records from the late 19th century were notoriously inconsistent, often fragmented by war, neglect, or deliberate destruction. Names appeared and disappeared without explanation, ages shifted, relationships were implied rather than stated. Yet once the hidden symbol in the photograph had been identified, archivists began searching for anything in the records that mirrored its shape or function, combing through inventories, bills of sale, medical logs, and correspondence with renewed attention. What emerged was not a clear narrative, but a pattern of absence. In ledgers dated just before the estimated year of the photograph, there were multiple references to an enslaved child of matching age and physical description. At first, the entries were unremarkable, listing rations issued, clothing distributed, labor deferred due to youth. Then abruptly the format changed. Where a name should have been, there was only a mark, drawn hastily but consistently, resembling the same symbol uncovered in the photograph. The handwriting matched that of the plantation overseer, a man known from other documents to be meticulous in his records, which made the deviation impossible to ignore. The symbol appeared only a handful of times, always in place of a name, always associated with the same age range. No explanation accompanied it. In margins where overseers often added clarifying notes, there was nothing. Even more unsettling was the fact that, after a certain date, the entries stopped entirely. The child did not age forward in the records, was not transferred, sold, or noted as deceased. The symbol simply vanished, as though whatever it represented had reached a conclusion that no longer required documentation. Historians debated the meaning of this erasure. One possibility was that the child had been moved off the plantation under circumstances that did not require formal recording, perhaps sent to another property owned by the same family. Another theory suggested illness or death, events that were sometimes minimized or left undocumented, especially in the case of children. Yet neither explanation accounted for the deliberate replacement of a name with a symbol. Erasure alone was common, but substitution implied a different intention, one that required a placeholder, a sign that something was still being tracked even if it was no longer spoken. As more records were cross-referenced, the symbol began to appear in unexpected places. In a medical ledger, a note about an unnamed child's condition ended with the same mark instead of a signature. In a letter between family members discussing house matters, a faint impression of the symbol was pressed into the paper where a seal might have been. These appearances were inconsistent enough to escape notice for generations, yet consistent enough to suggest a shared understanding among those who used it. The symbol functioned like a private language, one that allowed certain facts to be acknowledged without being written plainly. The discovery reframed the photograph yet again. If the child's name had been replaced by a symbol in official records, then the mark hidden in the image could not be dismissed as decorative or incidental. It appeared to be part of the same system, a way of aligning the visual record with the written one. The photograph was no longer just an image of a child. It was an extension of the ledger, another surface upon which ownership, control, or classification had been quietly inscribed. This realization carried profound emotional weight. Names are often the last trace of individuality preserved in historical documents, especially for enslaved people whose lives were otherwise reduced to labor and value. To remove a name and replace it with a symbol was to complete a process of abstraction, turning a person into a concept, a condition, or a problem to be managed. The fact that this abstraction appeared both in writing and in the photograph suggested coordination, as though multiple forms of record-keeping were being aligned to tell the same incomplete story. Researchers also noted the timing of the erasure. The disappearance of the name occurred shortly after the photograph was believed to have been taken, strengthening the connection between the two. It was as if the act of photographing the child marked a transition, a moment after which the child was no longer meant to exist in the records as an individual. The image froze a likeness at the precise moment when the written identity began to dissolve, creating a haunting contrast between presence and absence. Attempts to trace the symbol beyond this plantation yielded limited results, but oral histories offered a chilling parallel. Descendants of enslaved families from the region spoke of stories passed down in fragments, warnings about certain images, certain objects that were not to be questioned too closely. Some recalled references to children who were taken out of the book, a phrase whose meaning had faded but whose tone remained fearful. While these accounts could not be verified with certainty, they echoed the same pattern found in the records, suggesting that the erasure was remembered even if its details were lost. By this stage, the investigation had moved far beyond academic curiosity. The photograph, the symbol, and the altered records formed a closed loop, each reinforcing the others. The image no longer felt like a window into the past, but like a sealed container, holding a truth that had been deliberately compartmentalized. The replacement of a child's name with a mark was not just an administrative choice. It was an act that reshaped how that life could be known, limiting it to a shadow that flickered briefly in ink and silver before being withdrawn from history without explanation. The fifth turning point emerged not from archives or laboratories, but from voices that had never been written down, carried instead through families as fragments of caution rather than stories meant to be understood. As researchers struggled to interpret the photograph and the symbol embedded within it, some began reaching out to local communities connected to the land where the image was believed to have originated. What they encountered was not a clear account, but a pattern of hesitation. People recognized the subject immediately, not by name or likeness, but by circumstance. There was an unease that surfaced as soon as the photograph was described, a subtle tightening in tone, a reluctance to linger on details. In several families, elders recalled being warned as children about certain objects kept out of sight, images that were not to be stared at, not because they were cursed in any dramatic sense, because they invited attention that was not safe. These warnings were rarely explained. They were passed down as rules rather than narratives, delivered with the weight of experience but without context. When pressed, some elders described an old belief that looking too long at certain photographs could make something follow you home, not physically, but in memory, in dreams, in the small disruptions of daily life that resisted logic. What made these accounts particularly unsettling was their consistency. Families separated by distance and time described remarkably similar cautions, even when they did not share surnames or direct lineage. The language varied, but the core message remained intact. The photograph was not meant to be studied, only acknowledged briefly, if at all. Some spoke of headaches that followed prolonged viewing, others of recurring dreams featuring a child standing just outside the frame, waiting. These experiences were often dismissed within families as superstition, Yet the warnings persisted, carried forward even as belief in them weakened. Researchers approached these oral histories carefully, aware of the risks of romanticizing or exploiting generational trauma. Still, it was impossible to ignore how closely the warnings aligned with the photograph's behavior under scrutiny. The sense that the image resisted prolonged attention echoed the scholar's own discomfort. The way discussion stalled, tempers shortened, and focus drifted whenever the photograph remained visible for too long. What had been framed as professional unease now appeared to have a deeper lineage, one that predated modern analysis by more than a century. Some elders offered fragments of explanation, though always indirectly. One described the photograph as a keeper, an object made to hold something so it would not move freely. Another spoke of images used to fix a person in place when other forms of control were no longer sufficient. These explanations were never presented as fact, but as inherited impressions, metaphors shaped by fear and incomplete understanding. Even so, they suggested that the photograph had always been understood as active rather than inert, a thing that did something rather than simply showed something. The most chilling accounts involved a rule repeated across generations: never count the time spent looking. Children were told to glance and look away, to never sit with the image long enough to feel familiar with it. Familiarity, they were warned, was dangerous. It invited attachment, and attachment invited consequences. No one could articulate exactly what those consequences were, only that they were cumulative, growing heavier the longer the image was allowed to settle into the mind. As these stories were recorded, researchers noticed how often they emphasized responsibility rather than fear. The warnings were not framed as threats from the photograph, but as reminders of the viewer's role. Looking carried weight, attention had effects. This perspective reframed the image once again, not as a passive victim of misinterpretation, but as a site of exchange between past and present. To look was to participate, to enter into an unspoken agreement whose terms had been deliberately obscured. The oral histories also shed light on why the photograph had survived. Several families recalled that it was kept not out of affection, but obligation. It had to be stored properly, protected from damage, yet not displayed. Neglect, they believed, was more dangerous than concealment. This belief mirrored the careful preservation observed by archivists, suggesting that the photograph's journey through time had been guided by a shared, if unspoken, understanding of its importance. It was not meant to be lost, but neither was it meant to be understood fully. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these accounts was the way they blurred the line between memory and instruction. Descendants could not always distinguish what they had been told from what they had felt themselves. The photograph existed as a presence in family history even when it was physically absent, shaping behavior through avoidance rather than engagement. This kind of influence was difficult to measure, yet unmistakable in its effects, creating a legacy defined by restraint. By the time these oral histories were compiled, the investigation had reached a point where evidence no longer provided comfort. Each new layer reinforced the same conclusion from a different angle. The photograph had always been known as something that demanded limits. The experts' discovery was not that the image was disturbing, but that it had been recognized as such from the very beginning. The warnings passed down through generations were not reactions to new revelations, but echoes of an original understanding that whatever the photograph contained was never meant to be uncovered all at once, and certainly not without consequence.